Well, with me here in the studio, we have Onur Erim. He's a political advisor and author. Next to him is Ahmet Kasim Han. He's an international relations professor at Kadir Has University. And completing our panel is Andrew Gardner. He's Amnesty International strategy and research manager for Turkey. Gentlemen, thank you all for joining us. Let me start with you, Onur. 2 years on from that failed coup, is Turkey in a better place? Has it changed for the better?
Well, it definitely changed for the better if you look at it from the perspective of getting rid of the FETÖ organization, or at least, slashing onto it in a deeper way. Do we have a long way to go? I think so. I think part of the President Erdogan speech yesterday emphasized on that. Yes, we're definitely in a better spot. Are we feeling the effects of fighting such a big terrorist organization that is organized almost in the entire world? Yes, we are. I think we're going to suffer from it a little bit more. But to answer your question, we're in a better place than we were 2 years ago.
Ahmet Kasim Han?
Well, I think it's a multifaceted score. I have to say that we are in a better place, as I would agree with the previous speaker, on where we are fighting the FETÖ terrorist organization. But are we better off in terms of where we are, considering civic liberties, considering the rule of law? That is something that we have to be more careful on.
Being more careful, let's get the perspective from Amnesty International on human rights. Andrew Gardner. So, state of emergency ending, 2 years on. Democracy still standing. I guess if the coup had to succeed, you would have had a kind of nefarious military, almost the Gulen organization, FETÖ, like a crime syndicate running the place. So, in that sense, better off. Are you willing to give credit where it's due and say that 2 years on, Turkey is, I guess, better off?
I think if the coup attempt was successful, it would be an absolute disaster for human rights in Turkey. We can't even contemplate what the consequences would have been if the coup attempt was successful. But fortunately, it was prevented. This contemptible coup attempt was prevented, and it was right in these circumstances for any government to declare a state of emergency. But a state of emergency should be temporary, and it should be used for particular reasons to counter threats to national security. Unfortunately, what we've seen in Turkey is that the state of emergency has been abused, and instead of targeting people who were responsible for the coup attempt, journalists, activists, and many others have been targeted. Over 100,000 people have been dismissed, organizations have been shut down, permanently shut down, and these people had nothing to do with terrorism or the coup attempt. And even if the state of emergency is lifted, these disastrous effects will stay in place.
And for those who say thousands have been reinstated through the State of Emergency Procedures Investigation Commission, they reviewed the purges and they said, okay, well, some people who were fired, some people who were sacked can get their jobs back because we're going to review your case individually. Is there a silver lining there, even though you felt that post-failed coup, things were heavy-handed?
Well, more than 125,000 people have been dismissed arbitrarily through emergency decree without any evidence being presented whatsoever. Now, the commission has been established. More than 1,000 people have got their jobs back, which is obviously a good thing. But if you consider that 1,000 people have got their jobs back versus 130,000 who've been dismissed, it's clearly not enough.
Okay, so Onur Erim, the man makes a good point, right? He's using the word arbitrarily, not lightly, because he's saying you lost your job and nobody told you why. Is that fair?
No, it's not.
Tell me why.
Well, here's the reason. If we are here to discuss the imperfections of the Turkish justice system, yes, I would agree with a lot of things, especially the time that it takes for a court to rule upon any issue. I am actually one of those on my commercial side, my business, suffering from it because a simple rule that I need to get done for my business to continue hasn't been given for the last 8 months. What the guest to my far right has been saying about people being
geographically, not politically.
Geographically, of course. Well, I guess. That the people are in jail or are in courts without any evidence. No, it's just the imperfections of the justice system. And there is a lot of things imperfect about it right now, especially with the time issue, that there's nothing been presented yet. It will take some time, yes. You have to realize, first of all, this particular case cannot be compared to anything around the world. It is a case It is an attack that had been in the makings for the last 40 years. It's definitely has some international backings. So this is not going to go over away.
Let me ask Andrew, like, I mean, because you mentioned the numbers, right? Is it just that, given the nefariousness of the organization and how they worked, that perhaps those numbers are justified? This is how they worked within the system, and this needed to be done.
Those numbers would be absolutely justified if there was evidence against the people. But the fact is that there are tens of thousands of people in prison, either awaiting trial or as the trials continue. And what we've seen is that since the coup attempt, since the declaration of the state of emergency, the judiciary is being completely hollowed out. Judges have been dismissed, prosecutors have been dismissed, and the judiciary is under immense political pressure. And in these circumstances, it isn't possible for people to get a fair trial. There are many thousands of people who are in prison without any credible evidence against them. One of them is the chair of Amnesty International Turkey. He's been in trial, on trial now for nearly a year. He's been in prison for 13 months without any credible evidence against him, not a single piece.
Ahmet Kasim Han, the judiciary has been hollowed out since the failed coup of 2 years ago. Is that true?
Well, I would not say that that is true. Somehow, overlapping with my geographical position, I stand in between the two guests on this issue. Let's see what happened. As has been repeatedly said, this was a traumatic experience for Turkish society, and it's unlike anything that we have seen in modern history anywhere in Europe or in the Western world. And as such, I do understand that relating to it is very hard for the Western observers.
They worked in the shadows.
They worked in the shadows.
A standing army.
Such an occultistic organization has not been seen in the West for almost a couple of hundreds of years.
Do you feel they failed to understand it, or how they work?
I think to an extent they failed to understand.
But wasn't that also the fault of the Turkish government in failing to properly articulate the type of threat it was facing?
I mean, that would have been my second sentence following my first comment. Definitely so. But nevertheless, I do understand and empathize with our Western audience when it comes to understanding the gravity of what has happened in Turkey, the nature of this organization, so on and so forth. And this has been in the offing for 40 years. That also is correct. Even though it has accelerated in the past 15, 16 years, this organization has been infiltrating to the state mechanism with the explicit vision of overtaking the Turkish state. Now, if you look at the matter from that perspective, you would understand, and not meant as an apology, but you would understand, or you could at least empathize with the fact that these kind of corrective trends or corrective measures tend to overtake the reality of the situation. They tend to overshoot. And in this case, it has overshot. Plus, the Turkish state has been hollowed out by this organization. So taking the members of the organization out of the bureaucracy, including but not limited to judiciary, also created an hollowing out effect. And add on top of this the trauma that different segments of Turkish society has gone through over what has happened, you would see that the situation is not something that is foreseeable, or there is no, if I may, best case of dealing with such an organization. Turkish Islamists are finding themselves in a very perplexed situation in the face of what has been happening, because this organization has been propagating its Islamic contours to do what it has been doing. And seculars are also traumatized in a different way.
Yeah, and this is interesting because something that Ibrahim Kalin, the presidential spokesperson, had mentioned was the fact that this organization had sort of, I guess, piggybacked on people's religious fervor and their religious sincerity, right? What he had said, Onur Erim, is this. He said, "Today the Gulenist invasion of the hearts and minds of honest, hardworking Turks has completely ended. We have broken FETÖ's siege on our country's public institutions and civil society." In your first answer, you said it's not quite done yet. There's still a threat. So tell me why you're not as bullish over defeating them as Erdogan spokesman Ibrahim Kalin is?
I just want to be hesitant because we now know, at least I am certain, that this organization had been backed up by or a number of international organizations or governments in the past 40 years.
Was that maybe naivety rather than something more sinister?
Oh, especially not in
they
the last
saw
2
him
years.
standing for interfaith and so forth within the US, and they thought, oh, this is a nice palatable face of Islam.
Beyond that, the mere fact that the US government, after numerous attempts by the Turkish Justice Department and the government itself on his extradition, and the US government hasn't even taken him for questioning, I think, to me, proves that there is something involved within the US government, not necessarily POTUS, or at least the current one, that there is involvement of the US government with this organization at some level.
Okay.
So this tells me that it's going to take a long time for this to get resolved.
Or is it rather the fact that, Ahmet Kasim Han, that Turkey hasn't made a strong enough case maybe to show that Gulen is directly connected to it, and it's difficult to make that case? You can show Gulen's involvement throughout the night, Gulen's FETÖ, being in tanks and so forth, but it's very difficult to make that connection that the orders came from Pennsylvania, and you have to pass that legal standard for extradition.
Look, Imran, not only that, but also I believe that the approach that has been taken by the Turkish official authorities regarding fighting this FETÖist organization, which is a menace, no doubt about that. It's a ferociously vicious organization, no doubt about that. But exactly because of that, the judicial procedures that has been executed right after the coup should have had been more transparent than they had been. And there should have been a very clear discrimination of all those groups that have been involved in these in the attempt of the 15th of
But you believe
July.
it was more than just the Gulenists?
No, I do believe that the lump sum approach of the rule by decree system that has been brought forward since the coup attempt itself has created an atmosphere which is assiduous exactly to Turkey's rightful fight against the FETÖist organization.
And which brings me to the question, Andrew Gardner, because the state of emergency wasn't only to try and defang the threat, the Gulenist threat within the military, within the police, within the judiciary and so forth. The state of emergency was also to keep Turkey safe from Daesh attacks and PKK attacks and so forth. So it's ending, it's ended, and it's about to properly, formally end. For you, as Amnesty International, what needs to happen after that for you to feel you're happier about the response to the failed coup and what happens after the state of emergency?
The problem is that although the state of emergency was declared in order to fight terrorism and to fight FETÖ, it's affected the lives of ordinary people. So many people have been put in prison without evidence. Journalists have been targeted, activists have been targeted. Just for example, there is a ban on any form of events being carried out by LGBT organizations, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender organizations. This is an example of how the state of emergency has been abused for reasons which it was never intended to happen. What needs to happen now is that all these abusive measures that were brought in during the state of emergency, which should be temporary, but are in fact permanent, need to be abolished at the same time. So all the people dismissed under the state of emergency, they will stay dismissed. So there needs to be reforms to get Turkey back on the track of respecting human rights. The climate of fear that has engulfed Turkey over the last 2 years needs to be lifted. There needs to be a situation where civil society, which was once flourishing in Turkey, which is now sort of not able to carry out its legitimate work, whether that can, civil society can work again. If all these things are put in place, then Turkey is going on a very correct path. But unfortunately, that's not what we see at the moment.
Onur, do you accept and respect that? He's not saying it's all terrible. He's saying there's a bit of, I don't know, mission creep or overkill going on.
You know what this thing comes about, because I was in Istanbul airport, right, where the president landed at the night. I was deployed by the military. Somebody that has lived it right to the bone. What I have to keep reminding myself, and probably everybody, all friends across the world, is that this is a very, very different coup attempt. You cannot explain it, nor can you expect the regular rule of law with every other thing around the world when it comes to this.
Why can't you do it within the rule of law?
Because everything was out of rule. Show me one other country in the world, one other historical event where a coup plotters or the pushists have attacked their own people with nothing, no arms. Show me one other case in the history of the world that people with their bare hands stood in front of tanks. So this is a very, very unusual case. Nobody questioned 1/10 of this when U.S. Guantanamo Bay. Nobody questions France today when there's a permanent state of emergency.
But I mean, people do question.
Not that this gives Turkey the right to go over the rule of law.
Right.
But all I'm saying is it is not as bad as some of the people in Turkey or outside of Turkey make it to be. But at the same time, everybody has to realize, everybody has to understand what exactly happened here on the night of July 15th.
Ahmet Kasim Han, I'm completely out of time. I have to ask for extra time from my producer. So in 30 seconds, please, can you wrap us up?
Well, I think the key word here is permanent versus temporary, lump sum versus very detailed work. What has been happening by rule by decree is that the state of emergency was declared against the terrorist organizations that Turkey was facing, including but not limited to the FETÖist organization. So the emergency decrees, the state of emergency decrees, should have focused on those organizations and should have exclusively been about fighting those terrorist organizations. Whereas the approach taken by the state of emergency decrees have been a very lump sum approach. Everything has been managed or politically solved through state of emergency laws since 2 years. This has to end, and it's ending. And I think it is also unfair for the resilience of the Turkish democracy, which has proven itself exactly on that very night. Because the strength of a country, in my opinion, Imran, lies in the way that it can handle challenges, even extravagant challenges, under normal conditions. And Turkey is able to do that.
That was an extraordinary challenge for this entire nation. It's been 2 years. It's almost hard to believe sometimes. Onur Erim, Gardner, and Ahmet Kasim Han. This was an important conversation to have. I thank you all for joining us here.